My name is Emily Brewer. I'm the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and we're really glad that you're here with us this afternoon. This Zoom is being recorded and also pushing out to Facebook Live, so just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that. And we're really glad to have David Staniunas with us from the Presbyterian Historical Society today. So I'll introduce David in just a minute, but just in case anybody finds yourself here and not sure where you are or what you're doing here, welcome. This is a conversation about the history of Presbyterians and abolition movements. And so the description that we're going with is from John Rankin and Gideon Blackburn through Angela Davis' legal defense. This is a conversation with David Staniunas from the Presbyterian Historical Society, looking back at the ways that Presbyterians have participated in various abolitionist movements, or haven't, and how the light of those stories might illuminate contemporary abolitionist movements in new ways for the church. This conversation is part of a series of webinars and conversations that PPF has been hosting, as we are in a deep focus since June 2020 on the call to defund the police. And we hear that call really loud and clear from Black organizers especially. And we know that this call to defund the police is also comes from an abolitionist framework. So we'll learn a little bit more about what that means. But I want to note, especially since David and I are both white, that this is really important to name that this is a movement led by Black organizers, and we are trying to follow the lead and call of those organizers. And also that many of those current abolitionist organizers are drawing from historical abolitionist movements as well. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Also have to mention, as we're gathering a week after fascist pro-Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building, that we look back to history to understand and gain inspiration and also learn from mistakes to learn how we might respond now. And we know that both the abolitionist movements that we're talking about in the United States, both historical and contemporary, as well as what's happening in our country this week, is all connected by white supremacy and anti-Black racism especially. And so this work, while we're drawing from the wisdom and leadership of Black folks in the United States, this is our work to do as white folks. And I know that we're not all white on this call, but I wanted to especially name that since I am white. So I'm really excited to welcome David. David is a records archivist at the Presbyterian Historical Society, which is the national archives of the Peace USA. If you didn't know we had them, we do, and they're awesome. David went to Kent State University, Indiana University, and the University of Richmond, and he grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, and has lived in Philadelphia since 2004. So David, welcome.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody.
I wonder if you might start by telling us a little bit about who you are. We know kind of where you went to school and your job title. I wonder if you would share a little bit about who you are, and then just launch us into a conversation that you have for today.
Sure. I guess that means that I didn't write a sufficient biographical blurb. Sorry.
I didn't mean it like that. Just we know that you're more than just your degrees and your job title.
No.
And you bring that with you to your work.
Thank you for that. I suppose excessive modesty is a flaw at this moment. I suppose by way of saying, like, why am I the person who's here with you today? In the course of my job here is to be the first point of contact for any incoming archival collection. I get stuff off the elevator, onto the shelf, and into databases. And that has given me kind of like a crow's nest kind of view of Presbyterian history as it is being constructed through new archival collections. It wasn't until about 2015 when I felt that there was like a necessary conjuncture of archival practice, the stuff that I do in my daily work, and matters of social and racial justice. I think it was 2015 when I went to an archives conference in Cleveland shortly after the police murder of Tamir Rice. And it was the conjuncture of those experiences and kind of developing a new awareness of what was necessary for my daily work that has led me to be the guy who gets called upon to do a crash course in abolition movements. I live in Philly. I bike to work every day. I have an 8-year-old son. We're doing homeschooling because of COVID. That's some of the things that I am. So to begin with, I think I have to at first kind of temper expectations. There's no way that I could cook up in anything less than a year a complete historical overview of Presbyterian activity and struggle surrounding abolitionist movements, among them the abolition of slavery, the abolition of sex traffic. There are Presbyterians in the turn of the 19th, early 20th century working in San Francisco in particular, who were engaged in ending the sexual traffic of minors, to the abolition of child labor, for instance. You know, the Labor Temple in New York is on the forefront of that, to the abolition of the death penalty, which is a matter that Presbyterians worked on and is documented by a collection that we worked on last year from the Social Justice and Peacemaking Unit. There also is not and cannot be a single history of these movements and moments. What we have are fragments that reveal different meanings in different slants of light. But what I think I have as a spur to further action for this group are two vignettes, a 20th century story and a 19th century story, where Presbyterians encountered the costs and the consequences of seeking justice. So the first of these, I have kind of called Allowing the Astonished Church to Move Forward, where we ask the question, why did the UPC-USA fund the legal defense of Angela Davis? And we answer the question by saying it was not scared of Black power. That is the conjunction of the word Black and the word power. I'm going to drop, this is essentially what I've done. I'm doing kind of two interpretive attempts based around two articles. I'm going to make sure that I get links to the articles in the chat. The first is Reflections by Gayrod Wilmore, who recently passed, whose papers we have, which is from 2007. It's a survey of his career as head of the Commission on Religion and Race / Council on Church and Race from 1963 to 1972. In this article, Wilmore provides background on Hilkar's support for Angela Davis's legal defense, essentially telling us that it did not come out of nowhere, and that Presbyterians had been bearing the cost of their discipleship in different ways long before 1971. In the early part of his work, Wilmore was at work on the Hattiesburg Ministers Project in 1964, which is a series of direct actions, pickets, voter registration drives. At the time, he was in charge of between 200 and 300 volunteer ministers who would stay in Hattiesburg from 1 to 7 weeks, often without the approval of their wives and their clerks of session, arguably more importantly in a Presbyterian context. Many of these dudes lost their pulpits. I mention this just to say that there is an economic and a social cost to direct political action. And the point of turning the other cheek is that you have to put your face in a position to be struck first. The UPC-USA at the time had a record of resisting retrenchment on issues of racial justice. The original mandate for the Commission on Religion and Race was a 3-year mandate. They gave them $500,000 and said, we'll revisit this in 1966-67. At that point, Wilmore was afraid that the mandate would basically lapse. In '67, however, they got folded into the Board of National Missions, and they actually ended up gaining support from important figures like Kenneth Nye and Edler Hawkins. Nye, who was head of BNM, and Edler Hawkins, who was the first Black moderator of the church. They had a mandate to expand. At the '67 assembly in Portland, and this is Gay Wilmore's words, the church made a commitment to the Black Power movement that was more radical than anything that had been promulgated by the NAACP, the SCLC, or any Black denomination. And the assembly, in the overture that it passed surrounding Black Power, wrote, "The assembly encourages United Presbyterians to view the phenomenon of Black Power within the context of the white power we exercise, seeing in it both the legacy of a frustrated aspiration and the promise of a newly assertive self-identity." Again, this is just by way of saying the church's commitment to the Black Power movement didn't come out of nowhere. It's worth reflecting on the capacity of the church at that time to directly name white power, rather than to discuss variations on that language, to try to tease out gradations of privilege. This was a church that saw direct challenge to itself as an opportunity. James Forman and the folks who wrote the Black Manifesto were directly challenging white institutions. And instead of observing that challenge as a threat, the church chose to seek common cause with nonviolent members of the Black Power movement and to undertake constructive engagement. So after, skipping backwards a little actually, after 1965, following Martin Luther King Jr.'s Chicago campaign, Gay Wilmore found the opportunity to make common cause across denominations with major, Black Baptist and other Northern ministers to, as he says, claim the positive content in the demand for Black power by clarifying its nonviolent and constructive implications. So this is how the church went about engaging a challenge to the church. And through this, what he intended to create was a militant Northern counterpart to the SCLC. And that became the National Committee of Black Churchmen. So this is how the grassroots engagement with Black power proceeds. Reading Wilmore's reflections was interesting to me because, and specifically his emphasis on Black clergy doing things for themselves and the creation of a Black-led militant Northern movement. At all turns, usually in his oral histories rather than in polished articles, Wilmore is unceasing in rebuking white liberal paternalism. It's really clear that the prior year's work of kind of shipping white volunteers south as if the North didn't have its own brand of racism was something that was abhorrent to him. There's also no way to disentangle Wilmore's ecclesiology, like his understanding of what the church is and is supposed to be, from his political education. Both of these are shaped by the Black Power movement. He begins to gravitate toward ecumenical actions across Black churches rather than siloed actions within denominations, precisely because, and he has written this, he believes that in America there is kind of the Black church first as a definitive experience, and then denominational identity is fluid and arguably less significant. There are tons of sidebars that I would love to go down, but I don't want to take up everybody's time. And so what begins to happen in the 60s is that the Council on Church and Race, post-67, ends up representing a very white church in places where it more or less was not welcome. And this was by design. They were kind of the vanguard, clearing space behind which the white church could begin to occupy. According to Wilmore, we at COCAR refused to accept the assumption of some Black academics, secularists, and Black Muslims that Christianity is the white man's religion, and that the white church could only sell Black people down the river. The point is that COCAR was positioned to understand Black power. When James Forman's faction occupied Wilmore's offices and the offices of the National Council of Churches in the God Box, 475 Riverside Drive, New York City, in 1969, COCAR viewed the tactic as a prophetic demonstration against white Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish complicity in slavery and the continuing oppression of masses of non-whites at home and abroad. Per Wilmore, no one thought of calling the police. Wilmore doesn't mention it here, but in a 1981 oral history that is in our collection, he reveals that he strongly suspected that his home phone and the payphone outside of 475 Riverside Drive were both tapped. So his unwillingness to call the police is largely because he probably felt that calling the police was moot. Some kind of police was probably on the call already. Just dropping a link to stuff in our collections in the chat. Following 1969, although the church didn't come up with reparations in the strict sense that James Forman had called for, COCAR's immediate response to Forman's group, the Black Economic Development Cooperative, I believe, BEDC, was to fund bail bonds for protesters and other activists, and to deliver grants to what Wilmore calls freedom fighters via the Emergency Fund for Freedom. In the same essay, so again, Wilmore compares his work to that of an advanced reconnaissance team. He was one of Buffalo soldiers in World War II. And so he saw COCAR as being, intentionally way out in front of the church, assessing the enemy, understanding the lay of the land, and reporting back to the main body. Support for James Forman's group, like support for Angela Davis's legal defense, are to him strategic risks, allowing the astonished church to move forward into terrain as unfamiliar to white middle-class Presbyterians as Klan-controlled territory in Mississippi or the Bayou parishes of Louisiana. Here he's talking about the EFF, the Emergency Fund for Freedom, created by the General Assembly in 1970. The EFF assigned $65,000 to be distributed to presbyteries and synods to support persons who sought justice when and where it was in short supply. In 1970, St. Andrew Presbyterian Church in Sausalito, California, asked for $10,000 from the fund to support the legal defense of Angela Davis. COCAR approved, and Gene Turner, who's still with us, who was then working for the Synod of the Golden Gate, got the funds to the church, and from there to Angela's lawyers. So the ensuing furor, and I suppose I should pause and say for many of you guys on the chat, this is stuff from living memory. And many of you remember how this transformed the church, but it changed the church entirely. Though national church leaders like Bill Thompson, who was stated clerk, a little later, I guess, 71, Lois Stair, who was moderator, in official statements, national leaders very carefully appealed to basic constitutional values. The right of due process, equality before the law. But the conservative white church was not receptive. They maintained moderators, I guess, from about 1967 onward. It was the responsibility of the people who worked for the moderator, the staff who were assigned to them, to maintain what were called response files. And so we have them. The thickest batch of response files are about the Confession of 1967. And the second thickest are about Angela Davis. Negative responses to funding Davis's legal defense came in at about 70 to 1. The 1971 General Assembly called Kokar's activity into question. And 1 month later, Wilmore and Bryant George got on the phone and called 20 prominent Black Presbyterians, and each of them contributed $500 to restore the $10,000 payment to the UPC-USA. Their statement is here in the chat. There we go. And I'd like to sit with it for a little while. I'm going to pause and drink some water, everybody. I'm still adjusting to the etiquette of doing this. So to sit with the statement, the 20 donors, right? We are not reimbursing the church out of mere impulse, nor out of anxiety about the alarm some Presbyterians have expressed over this grant. We are not reimbursing the church to quiet the reaction of those who disagree with the Council on Church and Race for making the grant in the first place. We are not reimbursing the church as a way of releasing it from its clear responsibility. We hope that one day our action may be recognized as one which helped Presbyterians to continue a relevant mission. We believe that our action signals the fact that the days of white paternalism are over. Black men and women can stand on their own feet and will insist upon their dignity and self-determination. Again, paternalism is ending. We, like other Black people, have continued to have hope that the system of courts in this country will indeed become a system of justice. We stand fully behind efforts to see that Angela Davis receives a fair trial on the allegations made against her. We are appalled at the extent to which some Presbyterians are willing to go in condemning Angela Davis for her political views, even at the risk of undermining the basic principles upon which this nation was founded. This incident brings vividly to mind the fact the same technique was used to cut down Paul Robeson and drove W.B. Du Bois, one of America's greatest Black scholars, into exile. We condemn those, especially Christians, who would abridge the right of any person to due process under the law because of the individual's political views, condition in life, racial or religious background. I don't think a definitive account of what happened next. I don't think a definitive account of the post-1971 retrenchment on social justice issues and racial justice issues has actually been written. Wilmore kind of offhandedly here in this article cites the strength of the Presbyterian Lay Committee, an emboldened conservative clergy, and then external financial pressure on the church as causes for greater control and oversight of the national mission boards and agencies after 1971. There is a case to be made that Kokar's activity during the Black Power period posed less of a threat to white people in the pews or to society at large than to what Wilmore and others have called the ecclesiastical bureaucracy. What was at risk really were people's jobs. First of all, Wilmore's, and he resigns in 1972. Additionally, and I suppose just by way of clarifying and saying like, well, why are you talking about this? I'm trying to tease out essentially what are the costs of discipleship? Like what are the costs of doing this kind of work? And by extension, what are the things that are gonna throw up roadblocks for people when you actually begin to engage this process, right? People will think of their reputations, people will think of their jobs. At this point, all of this stuff is not happening in a vacuum. At the same time, the consultation on church union is still operating. There's a series of joint UPC-USA, Peace-US General Assemblies that dot the 1970s, where both the Southern Church and the National Church are getting together ensemble. Louisville in 74, Kansas City in 79. Wilmore acknowledges that Kokar was out in front of the denomination, right? And he having been personally accused of being a communist back in his Westchester days. When he lived in Westchester, Pennsylvania, his family single-handedly integrated the school district in the town they were in, and a member of the Presbytery of Donegal called Wilmore a communist agitator for doing that. Wilmore was surely aware of any extant campaign to link the Presbyterian Church to global communism. And support for Angela Davis for opponents of the church does that really nicely. For instance, here is a billboard that was taken out in Washington during the period. What's great about this billboard essentially says, why did the Presbyterian Church give $10,000 to communist Angela Davis? And the billboard writes out 10,000 with the extra 00 for cents, making it look like $1 million. So being tarred as communistic would, for UPC-USA national staff, completely upend their reunion work with the Southern Church. I mean, you can understand a kind of programmatic moderation setting in after that period. It turns out that that kind of epithet stuck anyway. Again, something else from our collection is news coverage of Presbyterian reunion in Atlanta, and it prominently features people opposed to so-called Northern socialism. So the epithet, the kind of public opprobrium, if people are going to tar you, they're going to tar you one way or another. And very little was gained by programmatic moderation in any case. I'm going to drop this link. Oh, wow. Judy Yu remembers the Donegal Presbytery event. Thank you for that, Judy. So much of this, again, is in living memory. So this is this is a whole decade worth of one portion of the church's national agency offices becoming a vanguard and getting out ahead of the church and then paying the price for it. The second story I have is a 19th century story. I'm sorry, y'all, it's so dry in here. I'm gonna lose it. This chapter, if we were doing like a podcast or something, would be called The Era of the Age in Which They Lived. We're going to ask the question, why did slavery persist among Presbyterians in Virginia? And we're going to answer it with economic interest, self-serving rationalizations in defense thereof, and a self-reinforcing slaving society. So the article that I'm kind of engaging with is called The Worst Kind of Slavery. It's in the Journal of Southern History. It's written by Jennifer Ost. It dates to 2010. And you can download that here for reading either now or later. So this is the story of Briary Presbyterian Church, which is Prince Edward County, Virginia, which is, South Central Virginia, really close to Hampton, Sydney. Their earliest records go back to 1760. They're held at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. In 1766, this church built a subscription fund for the purchase of slaves to be hired out year to year. The funds raised were designated for the minister's salary and for maintenance of the church building. The first person that the congregation bought was a woman in her 20s named Nell on February 16th, 1768 for 67 Virginia pounds, 10 Virginia shillings. So a subscription fund of the 1760s is basically akin to church investments today, right? We pursue advantage, the sustenance of pastors and their pensions, renovation of buildings, using the economic tools that are available to us. Occasionally we're called upon to oppose the use of those economic tools, but we largely demur. Like this church, we kind of expect to be written up as people defined by our times and we discover pragmatic justifications for our behavior. You don't need to go all the way back to the 18th century to find examples of this. In the 2014 plenary debate on recommendations from the Committee on Middle East Issues to divest from Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, and Caterpillar, owing to these companies' direct complicity in the occupation of Palestine. Justifications for inaction include, one, the need to maintain interfaith dialogue to promote a two-state solution. Two, the one-sidedness of the majority report for divestment. Three, the reality that a Board of Pension divestment list does not translate into a sell order, just a do not buy. If you want to view original footage of the plenary debate, that is right there. So what's meant by that third thing, quoting the Board of Pensions representation, when we notify our managers of the other companies of the divestment list, if they own them, they can retain them in the portfolios they manage for us. So again, if the three companies are put on the divestment list in December, our managers would be told these companies are on the divestment list, you cannot buy them, but if you do own them, you'll be grandfathered. For what it's worth, Israel would begin bombing Gaza a little more than 3 weeks after this debate, killing, most estimates say, 2,200 people. You put that link in the chat too. I promise we'll go back to the 18th century and get away from 2014 in a second. This is all by way of saying we find pragmatic reasons, reasons of utility or necessity to steer us away from the things that we are otherwise called to do. Justifications of the institution of slavery in Virginia from the 1760s to the 1840s, this is the period we're talking about here, were essentially paternalistic, and Presbyterian responses were the same. In 1787, what was then the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, before we had a National General Assembly, responded to an abolitionist overture with a statement advising Presbyterian slave owners to prepare their bondspeople for eventual freedom by educating them and raising them in the gospel, and to let people buy their way out of slavery or be manumitted at a moderate rate. So to repeat, slave owners found justification before the church so long as they cared for their bondspeople as if they were children. Whoops, there we go, thank you. A humane or a tolerable slavery was at the time widely contrasted to Briary's hiring out of its slaves. Again, why Jennifer Oates calls this the worst form of slavery, which was called jobbing. Rereading this, I'm reminded that by kind of manufacturing distinctions of degree, wholly evil institutions can be maintained. This is the worst. So let's address ourselves to the worst possible conditions. And that actually ends up sustaining the rest of the institution. You can see this, for example, in the response by states to the 1980s, 1990s movement to end capital punishment. The response that states had was to curb the worst excesses, which at the time was the electric chair. The electric chair, in turn, was introduced in states at first because the most offensive form of capital punishment at the time was hanging, which was criticized because it looked exactly like a state-sponsored lynching. And the timing of when states replaced hanging with the electric chair basically follows the activism surrounding, like anti-lynching movements. Florida converted to electric in 1923, Alabama in 1927, Virginia in 1908. The reform away from the electric chair and toward lethal injection follows 1990s attempts to publicize botched electrocutions. And so states address themselves to the worst excesses of the institution. Florida converts in 1999, Alabama 2002, Virginia in 1994. 20 or 30 years later, following those movements, 28 states still have the death penalty. It's a kinder, gentler death penalty, but it still exists. I'm going to give you one more link in the chat. In the event that anybody misses the chat or you're sitting on a mobile device and can't see the stuff, we'll make sure to get these links out to you by email or somehow. Reflecting back to the 19th century, this congregation understood at several different points that it would judge itself for its behavior, and there was conflict within the church from the 1820s through to the 1860s about maintaining their human property. The church would judge itself, and they also knew that they would be judged externally and by history. And there's proof in their records of this. James Douglas, who was pastor at Briary in the 1820s, wrote a history of the church, I think it's 1828, which accounted for its purchasing slaves this way. In the appropriation of their funds, many will think they erred, but it was the error of the age in which they lived, and their names and motives should be respected by their descendants. The error of the age. So a number of distinctions are flattened by this phrase, and they make slavery persist. Douglas is essentially judging the 1770s Briary Church in anticipation of the 1820s Briary Church judging itself. He knows his own age is in error, and he's asking the readers of his history for a kind of moral pre-clearance. Douglas is also conjoining reverence for the dead, right? Respect for their names, and reverence for their actions, respect for their motives. Attaching the immoral actions of the group to the allegedly, presumably more or less moral people, as if the actions don't speak for, as if your actions don't speak for themselves, as if it's enough to say wicked things were done by good people. We have to assume they meant well and just found a bad outcome by accident. In the near term for that church, those tortuous rationalizations don't even end up working. William Hill, a subsequent pastor who was minister at both Briary and at the nearby Cumberland Church in the mid-1830s, attempted to get Briary to liberate its slaves outright and then to fund their transit to Liberia via the American Colonization Society. Briary elders refused. Hill asked them to sell their slaves to a master who would not job them out, thereby separating their families. Briary refused, and Hill quit that pastorate. So our author of this article, Jennifer Ost, notes that Hill is not an abolitionist. He's a paternalist. He believes slavery is divinely ordained, but the pattern he follows is instructive. He essentially makes compromise positions. Every compromise position emboldens the hardliner. The hardliner sees the other party gradually moving toward his position, right? Hill moves for liberation outright, then for manumission and ACS, then for sale to a kinder master. Each step is closer to the hardline position, the maintenance of that congregation's ownership of human beings. In the 1840s, this doesn't go away. Briary again discusses what to do with its slaves. An action to sell Briary's slaves, again, not liberate them and thereby endanger the church property, but sell them and therefore realize at least some gain, goes to a committee, which ultimately rejects the idea, but it generates a minority report written by a slave owner named Asa Dupuy. So the minority report draws out the contradictions facing the congregation as slave-owning Christians. And as such is testimony contradicting James Douglas or anyone who chalks up immorality to the errors of the age. The minority's concerns are chiefly about marriage and the family. The date is May 1846, and the minority rights of the slaves. We believe their present condition is unfavorable to their moral and religious character, with their family connections formed 1 year in one neighborhood, and the next be removed so far that they can seldom visit or be visited by their families, and in that way liable to have them broken up and new connections formed. So they're talking about marriage and family. Slave marriages were not honored by the state, but they were promoted by churches as part of their paternal responsibilities, bringing people up in the faith. Dupuy here objects to the hiring out of slaves not on its own terms, but because it damages marital fidelity, which is something that the church is sworn to uphold. This church, again, is defending marital fidelity over and against elementary human rights. The minority also expresses concern for the physical well-being of its slaves, and this well-being is measured in deliverable children. They write, with regard to increase, they certainly have not increased in the same ratio that other Negroes have, which we think is probably owing to the want of attention, which it would be the interest as well as the duty of masters to give to the children of their slaves. Again, kind of calling upon the paternalistic defense of slavery. If you're going to maintain this institution, at least you have to do it in a humane way. Here, a personal rather than a corporate owner presumably has a long-term interest in slaves' fecundity. Someone who hires them out has no interest in a slave woman, still less for her children. And people who hired out Briary slaves actually received something like a 40% discount if a woman in their hire became pregnant during the year. They get hired out for $25. If the woman was pregnant, they would pay $15. So here, Jennifer Oast is brilliantly teasing out the church's double bind. If women formed relationships on the job and had children, the church was abetting adultery. If the women were faithful and didn't have children, the church begins to be at a financial disadvantage, which negates the whole purpose of why they were engaged in this in the first place. Fortunately for us, and arguably owing to the contention inside Briary Church in the 1840s, from 1840 to 1847, the church keeps detailed records of the people that it owns, revealing naming conventions among enslaved families that span 3 or 4 generations, listing who was hired out where and for how long. During the 1840s, Briary owned about 50 slaves. The numbers moved because of births and deaths. 28 were hired out, typically for 2 years, and typically hired out alone. And as much as the minority report from Briary regretted marital infidelity among hired out slaves, it never expressed any care or concern for the other family bonds that were violated in the process between parents and children, between siblings, grandparents, and so on. The minority's concern for the increase of slaves is documented statistically in the records of the church. There are 14 children born to Briary slaves in the period. 6 would die before age 3. According to research done in the 1980s, this is triple the average child mortality for Virginia slaves of the same time period. This is all by way of saying the Briary Church knew that even by the standards of their own era, they were doing something heinous. They were also setting an example for society and contributing to broad social acceptance of their actions. Briary's records again give us a picture of the economic status of the white people who hired slaves. 65 of them in all during those 7 years. They range from a shoemaker who hired out a boy at par, meaning for nothing other than room and board, to a widow who would be indigent in 1850, to a guy, Dr. John Peter Matower, who was the father of plastic surgery in the United States, to William Watkins, who was the richest landowner in Charlotte County, right next to Prince Edward. He was worth $22,000, which is about $30 million today. The ownership of slaves by institutions, the capacity to hire them out, had benefits for poor whites who otherwise are not able to purchase slave labor. Institutional slave owners receive social support from poor whites for a system they otherwise should have opposed. that it was in their interests as a class to oppose. In any philanthropic endeavor, economic necessity finds moral justification. So at Briary, for the sake of guaranteeing that the gospel is preached well, a church finds economic necessity for inhumane acts. It then shores up what was once a matter of simple necessity with moral justification. Slavery is divinely ordained. Duty calls us to Christianize enslaved Africans. We fail to discharge our duty when we job out slaves, and so on and so on. But financial interests drive and reap the rewards for these choices. Only a third of the people who bought slave labor from Briary were church members. The slaving society at large supported this church's so-called philanthropic endeavor more than the believers did. And far from convert all of Virginia to Presbyterianism, Presbyterian slave owners ended up justifying a slaving society to itself. As Jennifer Oast concludes, if a church was willing to own slaves, and if God's work could be furthered by slave labor, how could slavery itself be morally wrong? Rather than transform those around them, they were conformed to the world. So this is a departure point. You have questions before you for the rest of the year, it sounds like, if I understand your process. In the best Presbyterian tradition, you're going to enter into a period of discernment. You're going to discern whether it's enough for you to support police reforms, whether it's enough to address the worst abuses of the police and prison industrial complex. What you've heard today in the example of Briary is that reforms tend toward accommodating a hardline position. A hardliner sees you moving toward him, not the other way. You've also heard that you won't be absolved by future generations. Even the people of the 1840s kept statistics that showed their particular form of slavery was especially abusive, and they could not absolve themselves. There's no grading on a curve for the errors of the age. You're also likely going to address the necessity or the utility of the police and prison industrial complex. You're going to be hard-pressed to imagine a society without police in it. But you've been reminded that Virginians of the 1840s couldn't conceive of a society without slave labor. You've been reminded that paternalistic defenses of slavery were all overwhelmed by abolition. This church never liberated its slaves. That took a war. And I think in the work of Gay Wilmore and the people of Kokar, we're all reminded of the costs of discipleship, which for them included government surveillance, white vigilantism, public opprobrium, private slander, and economic hardship. Thanks for your time. The time is yours.
Thank you, David, for those stories and context. And I'm just really struck by how, in both of the examples that you kind of did a deep dive into for us, how much money drives so much of our moral positions, and how much we do to justify using moral language what is really in our best economic interest. And when I say we, I mean we, the institution of the church, that is typically it's still even most power held by white folks. And just how much we have to reckon with that. And I think that, and I mean that for all of us, for the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship as well, who we have an endowment, and we need to think about how we're using our resources that have largely been gained through white access to resources, how we're using those. And so I'm thinking about the money component is like a thread I want to pull out for us. And also what you lifted up throughout and summarized really well at the end, that we tend to look at the worst and then say, okay, but we're not quite that bad. So we're going to make our position, and it becomes a reformist position. And I think really, I want to read a definition of abolition from Critical Resistance, which is one of the main groups right now pushing for abolition of police, and have been pushing for the abolition of the prison industrial complex for decades. Because I think it's really stands in contrast to this kind of like incremental reforming that you were sharing with us about. So this is Critical Resistance, what they say about abolition. Abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It is also about undoing the society we live in. It is a broad strategy that means we must build models today that represent how we want to live in the future. This means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us forward. And it means living this vision in our daily lives. And just how I think we also really need to name that is a group led by queer Black women, and that their vision is not incremental. However, the vision is total transformation. And also we go about that total transformation by acts in our daily lives. And so I think we'll, if you're available to stay, David, for a few more minutes, we'll stop the recording, but we'll take some questions because I know some folks need to log off. But I just want to challenge us all as we go from this learning of abolition movements in Presbyterian history into the world today, in which abolition is becoming a more household term. And I think it's our work to not just make it a household term, but a household vision and a church-wide vision, to make it kind of normal, like something that everybody's excited about is a world without the violence of the state. And so in that, I think one step that we can all take today is to just have a conversation with somebody about something that you've learned today. My colleague Allison says it's better to have a conversation than just to have a position. But so share some of what you're learning and wondering and what's challenging to you, and to start having these conversations in our churches if you're not. And if you are, find the places that are controversial and move toward that disagreement and explore kind of where the hard parts are, because I think that's really where we have to learn and to grow. So I'll invite Sarah to stop the recording now for folks who are, and if you need to go, we thank you for joining us. And if you want to stay on and ask a few questions of David, we'll welcome that.